Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 52, for the week ending May 12, 2017, the Firing the Investigators edition. This week, Jay and I have a wide-ranging discussion on some of the week's top compliance-related stories. We discuss an interesting article by Michael Volkov in Corruption, Crime, and Compliance about the real risk of an FCPA enforcement action. We take a hard look at FIFA firing its internal investigators for doing their job, i.e. investigating. Jay discusses the Ethics and Compliance Initiative report on the use of corporate monitors. We discuss the role of judgment in a CEO as opposed to tone at the top, and consider some of the actions of Barclays' Jess Staley as reported by James Stewart in his Common Sense column in the New York Times. We highlight the role of incentives in a corporate compliance program. We discuss the Astros having the best record in baseball and the Rockets gagging on the big one, Game 6 loss to the San Antonio Spurs. Jay previews his weekend report, Compliance Lessons from a Trip to the San Diego Zoo. Finally, listeners to this podcast can receive a discount to Compliance Week, which I will link to in the show notes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 52 for the week ending May 12th, 2017, the Firing the Investigators edition. As always, I'm joined by my cohort and co-host, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors. Jay, welcome.
Good morning, Tom. Looking forward to jumping into this week's stories. We've got a potpourri of corporate potential malfeasance. How's that for a mouthful?
That's almost as good as saying that the Houston Astros have the best record in Major League Baseball.
And somebody was complaining that they were switched from the National League to the weaker American League.
That's much weaker American League. So, although we have to bookend that with the Houston Rockets gagged on the big one last night and lost to a San Antonio Spurs team who had their two best players out on injury, playing at home, must-win Game 6, and I think they lost by 35 points. It was one of the great gags of all time in professional sports, even beyond Houston sports, where we gag all the time. So, I don't know what your thoughts on that might be, but mine were that I have to put this one on the coach because I think the players were just absolutely gassed, and they just had nothing in the tank. He was playing a 6- and 7-man rotation for the last 4 games, and I just don't think you can do that in the playoffs. But good luck to the Spurs, although I think we're just they're a mere roadblock, if at all, in the way to a third consecutive finals between the Golden State Warriors and Cleveland Cavaliers.
Well, I don't know. You got me on the Boston bandwagon last week, and they're up 3-2 on the Wizards. So who knows? Maybe there's something happening with Isaiah Thomas, maybe with his situation with his sister. Maybe there's something magical about that team. So we'll have to see what happens with the Celtics and the Wiz. Yep.
So anyway, but as you said, Jay, kind of an interesting week. No real FCPA enforcement action announcements, but lots of things in compliance and ethics. So one of the articles that struck me this week from the Commentariate was an article by Mike Volkov about the real risk in an FCPA enforcement action. And you know, you have been involved in multiple investigations. You've been involved as a service provider and to multiple companies who've gone through this process. And you would probably have some pretty good idea of what the real costs are. But I think Mike was right to identify that the fine and penalty is really, while not insignificant, is not the most significant cost. Certainly you have reputational issues. Investigative and remediation costs can run from 2 to 6 times what the final fine and enforcement. And I'd like to focus on the cost, the kind of psychic cost to the corporation, because I talked to I interviewed Dan Chapman on this issue once. Dan is the former CCO at Parker Drilling and got them through their enforcement action. Then he went over to Cameron, got them through another issue. Now he's the CCO at Vimpelcom after their enforcement action. So big job there. But he said the psychic cost of people worrying about FCPA investigations and even the time. Parker Drilling, he estimated that senior executives spent at minimum 25% of their business day on issues related to the enforcement action, whether that be responding to a request for production, providing information to him or outside counsel, working on the remediation, retraining and retrenching. So you have both people having to actually do work around those issues, and then kind of the cost of everything stopping just to worry about that. So, and that didn't even get to reputational damage, stock price issues, whether you're going to be put on a debarred list formally by the government or informally by companies who are not going to do business with you going forward. So lots of different issues that I thought Mike really articulated well. So what were your thoughts?
Well, I kind of took this in a different way. He's entitled this the real risk of an FCPA enforcement. And I think, Mike did a wonderful job of articulating that we live in a much smaller FCPA world from an information perspective, from a cooperation perspective. So while we're always talking about the internal calculus that a company needs to do to decide whether or not they need to self-disclose and go forward, Mike really talks about that you could have multiple touch points where a potential FCPA violation could be known to the government. It might happen in the location in a foreign country where you're working, and that might be known by the government, and that could be shared with the DOJ and the SEC. You have whistleblower actions. You have all sorts of different things, all sorts of things in terms of trade and tariffs. So there could be many different times, or even just an industry that you're working in. A couple of years back, there was lots of things happening in China and happening with regard to the pharmaceutical industry. So not only do you have to look at the cost to the company, the psychic costs, the optical costs, but I think you also really have to take a look at what are you doing within your house. And I think, my takeaway from Mike's thing is that there is much more chance of something seeing the light of day. So gone are the days of just kind of sweeping this under the rug. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be vigilant, that you shouldn't self-remediate, that you shouldn't assess, but it just means that if something like this does come up, there is a higher chance of risk that the government, that the feds, that the DOJ and the SEC might be knocking on your door.
That's absolutely right. And just the even the number of ways you described that the information could get to the government, I would say it's really exponentially beyond that as well. Competitors, other governments, disgruntled employees, disgruntled former employees, the newspaper, the press, fourth estate, as we have seen in several very high-profile cases. So you're right, Mike's absolutely right, and just the costs alone for all of these issues really, I think, lead to a solution of putting a best practices compliance program in place and actually operationalizing your compliance program so that, one, you would detect and prevent, but two, if something does come up, you have your best chance to get a very favorable result from the government. Jay, we had a very high-profile firing of a lead, actually two lead investigators, not one, in a very high-profile government investigation this week. And we're not talking
we're not talking about something here in the U.S. We're talking about an article that Tom contributed to Compliance Week on May 10th, and it's entitled "FIFA Fires Its Own Investigators." So what happened, Tom?
So I think most of the listeners of our podcast have followed the affairs of FIFA through their corruption scandal. The U.S. Department of Justice really leading the efforts to try to break the corrupt cabal that was running FIFA through a variety of laws other than, not including specifically the FCPA, money laundering, extortion, bribery, various other white-collar laws that were broken by FIFA executives in awarding World Cup bids out in 2018 and 2022. But FIFA itself really doesn't seem to have learned very much because they fired both the judge, the prosecutor, and the judge. The judge was a gentleman named Hans Joachim Eckert, and a prosecutor, Cornel Borberly, who were the lead investigators for internal corruption at FIFA. And they were in the middle of several high-profile investigations of FIFA employees, not employees, of executive committee members. And so they were just fired. And clearly thinking that they could get away with it, the FIFA board, led by the current new head of FIFA, has fired them. So one would ask the question whether FIFA is actually serious about cleaning up its own house, how the Department of Justice and others will respond when FIFA is trying to claim it's really a victim of all of these senior execs and board members, executive committee members, bribery and corruption. And here they terminate the people who have been brought on specifically to investigate it. So optically, it's horrible for FIFA. On the other hand, they don't answer to anybody. They're a private organization headquartered in Switzerland, domiciled in Switzerland. Apparently, they don't answer to the Swiss government, so they can pretty much do whatever they want. They do not take, for the most part, government funding, so there's really no sanction that can be levied along those lines. There are businesses, of course, and national soccer organizations that fund FIFA and keep it going, but those organizations do not seem to have really been too bothered by any of this and are continuing to support FIFA. So whether you can get away with firing the lead investigator in the United States or Switzerland will be, I think, debated going forward, but very, very bad optics for FIFA. I would say that was damaging reputationally, except that I'm not sure their reputation could be damaged any more than what's gone on. One can only wonder what the Department of Justice will think about this, and if the DOJ turns its sights on FIFA, really where they might take that portion of the investigation going forward.
Now, did you say FIFA is set up as a nonprofit? Was that what you said or not?
It is, yes.
So it's like my other favorite sports organization, the National Football League?
No, it's not, because there's no control over FIFA. In the United States, there is some modicum of control by U.S. law over U.S. nonprofits. Apparently in Switzerland, for international organizations, there's basically no controls or oversight from the government. So here in the United States, you can have a National Football League making, I think at last report, some $18 billion. Of course, nonprofit status. You can have a commissioner who runs rampant over the rights of both member teams and individual employees, i.e. the players.
Tom Brady.
But there are others that have been rights run over as well. But at the end of the day, the tax code in the United States and the U.S. government will control. That's not true at FIFA. So it's really unfair to compare the National Football League, because I don't think you can accuse the owners, the members of the executive committee, the multi-billionaires who own the teams, of having engaged in bribery and corruption to actually get their franchises.
Great. Thank you for swatting that softball.
Yes. So, Jay, we had a very interesting report from the ECI, the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, around the use of corporate monitors. So why don't you kind of pick it up from there?
Sure. We're very excited about this. The benchmarking group was headed by Eric Feldman, one of my colleagues at Affiliated Monitors, and we also did sponsor the research. And what this new report indicates is that the use of monitors by public and private sector organizations is on the rise as a preferred risk assessment tool. So I know earlier in the year, I was lamenting that there does not seem to be a lot of activity upon the DOJ enforcement front. There's a little bit more activity under SEC. And what we're finding, as the report states, that people are looking at using self-mandated monitors as a preferred risk assessment tool. And basically, the benchmarking report includes information that talks about how you go about selecting a monitor, contracting for monitor services, and completing a monitor engagement. Basically, it's a practical guide into working with voluntary or court appointment monitors, and the report provides tips for managing a monitoring engagement in a way that establishes and sustains trust between the parties and maximizes the value of addressing issues related to the monitorship. Further, the report details what to consider when selecting a monitor and provides direction through the full monitor engagement lifecycle. So we're very excited to be partnered in this with ECI. And in the show notes, we will have a link to the news release where you can download the executive summary of this report. The full white paper is available to ECI members. And then additionally, we're going to have another Easter egg for you, that we will have a link to a webinar that Eric participated in with Michael Callens from NASDAQ, and there will be a link to that in the show notes. So, this kind of continues a theme that Tom and I have been, discussing for the better part of this year, that there is definitely a rise in the use of monitors, and not only from a regulatory perspective, but also, as the report says, as a tool for companies to use for self-assessment, and then even potentially if there is self-remediation. We've always talked about that you only have one chance to go forward to the DOJ, and you want to go forward and be as credible as possible. And if you've started to do self-assessments and do self-remediation, I think that goes a long way into discussing how serious a company is about handling issues internally that arise.
So Jay, is that really the second part, the voluntary use of a monitor? Is that something that you and Affiliated Monitors are seeing companies use more often? Is it used in what I would call the anti-corruption compliance space, or is it used in other spaces? And if it's used in other spaces, is there not really cross-fertilization, but cross-lessons that our primary audience of anti-corruption compliance specialists might be able to take home?
Yeah, a lot of different areas to answer in that question. What I'll first confirm is that yes, we are seeing a rise more of the proactive self-initiated monitor, and really, when a monitor comes in, we are there to support the company, but at the same time, we're there representing a regulatory body. So there's sometimes a misconception on, are we the NARC or are we supporting the company? So in terms of, supporting the company, when we are in there, we are in a different position than if a law firm or outside counsel is in there. They're really in there more from a gotcha perspective, that they are running an investigation and they're looking for data points that either point to further malfeasance or say that, everything is okay. What we are in there is we're more concerned about looking at the culture of an organization, and kind of like when you're talking about embedding controls in the organization, we're looking at helping the organization come up with the best path on a go-forward basis. So how do we prepare them? How can we inculcate culture? And how can we put them on a path that they will not be recidivists? So those are the goals, I think, by bringing on an internal monitor, that we are there. We've done over 500 engagements since 2004. So we have, cross-industry experience, and we're very well, educated on where do we look for, where are the pressure points, where does culture need to be improved. And that is not really something that is addressed on the initial investigation. It might be investigated. I guess investigated is the wrong word, but it might come to play in the future remediation after there's been some type of a settlement. But we'd like to get in there early, use our knowledge, and help companies start building ethics and culture into their day-to-day activities.
And Jay, if I could just maybe give a little bit of a teaser hint, if you're going to be in Houston on November 2nd, Eric Feldman's actually going to speak to the Houston Greater Ethics and Business Roundtable, or Houston Business Ethics and Business Roundtable, on this topic. So Gerber will be presenting Eric Feldman. Hopefully, if you're in town, you'll be able to join us. But it's really a fascinating area. I heard about it multiple years ago, and now it's as within many developments in our field, Jay, we see something that at one time was very few people were doing, and then it became sort of cutting edge. Then it became best practices, and now it's just sort of a regular practice. And this type of proactive use of an outside expert on a really ongoing basis can really help drive the operationalization and efficiency of your compliance program. So I'm going to be very interested to see from the service provider perspective what insights you can bring, because I really want the greater compliance community to understand this is a very valuable tool, and I'd like to see more use of it, more discussion of it. Obviously, this report that ECI has put out is very significant, and we will look forward to continuing this discussion, because I find this development very, very positive for the entire profession.
I appreciate you taking some time and shining some light on it. And I guess we can go back into the weekly stories, and we have another article that you found from one of our favorite places, the New York Times, and one of our favorite business writers, James B. Stewart. So, Tom, tell us what is the latest news from Barclays?
So this is really the question I wanted to pose, Jay, to both of you and to our listeners. We, Tone at the Top is, if not the most ubiquitous, one of the most ubiquitous statements in compliance. But this article by James Stewart talked about Jess Staley, the current CEO of Barclays, and it really focused on judgment. And that's really not something that I think the compliance profession really discusses enough, which is judgment of a CEO and judgment of senior executives. And what really differentiates someone who's been an extremely successful business person, may have been an extremely successful division president or executive vice president, EVP, from a truly great CEO. And that may come down to judgment, because Stewart detailed two really lapses in judgment of Jess Staley. And the first one we've talked about at some length on this podcast, which is where he tried to use company's internal security department to unmask an anonymous whistleblower. And there was also information about his Staley's going after a business competitor who had made a hostile takeover of a company that his brother-in-law was involved with. And the kind of familia contact, not so much as a conflict of interest, but really putting the interest of his brother-in-law above that of his business. And where the company that Barclays was doing business with was in a position contra to the interests of his brother-in-law. And when you have a CEO engaging in those types of missteps of judgment, I'm really of the opinion that that can portend a situation further down the road where a much more serious misstep can occur, up to and including illegal conduct. Now, coming from Houston, Enron is never far from anyone's mind, and Ken Lay was clearly a person of very poor judgment, criminally convicted for his part in the Enron case. So that example is never far from anyone's minds down here. But it was a really interesting article, and it really got me thinking about what's the difference between a top senior exec and a CEO, and why and how a CEO it is different. In one of my podcasts, my podcast on business leadership, 12 O'Clock High, Richard Lummis and I explored this issue more in depth, because a CEO, people really watch a CEO much more closely, much more than you would watch an EVP or a division president. And everyone turns on and hangs on the words, the phrases, the body gestures, the unintended signals, the nonverbal signals of a CEO to try to figure things out. And when you've got a CEO who twice now, once engages in what I think was, if not illegal, certainly unethical conduct in trying to unmask the anonymous whistleblower, and then as to going to bat for his brother-in-law against clients of the firm, that was certainly violated a business judgment, if not unethical behavior. Really points to lapses in judgment. And how I once heard James Baker ask before the 2008 election, how can you determine if somebody's qualified to be president? He said, well, it's pretty easy. You elect them president and see if they can do the job. But at first I was persuaded by that, but now I'm beginning to think that, maybe that's just too easy, because there are going to be situations where you can look at somebody's past history and see they made a series of missteps. They made a series of mistakes in judgment. And that could lead, if they are a leader of a very large organization, to a catastrophic failure, whether that failure be of a country, or whether that failure be of a company, which could lead to illegal conduct, certainly what we saw in Houston around Enron. So I was just fascinated by the issue of judgment, and that's really something we don't talk about, I think, at all in our world, and maybe that's a discussion we need to start having.
Well, I think that, what we've kind of seen out there with all these confirmation hearings, over the last few months, is that it really seems to be very difficult to separate your ethical answers from political answers. And we've seen there are very many depth ways that these people can avoid answering a question. And they can say, well, it's a hypothetical, or, of course I would do this, or I can't tell you I'm going to do that. So, I like the point that you bring up before, that, past performance doesn't necessarily dictate how somebody's going to behave. So if you can't, base that decision on the past performance, what is that indicator that you're going to use? We're all looking for red flags, right? We want to make sure that we're doing business with people who are honest and reputable. So, when are those red flags viable, and when are they not? And I guess the other kind of more deeply hidden point is that, if you're a good manager, or if you're a good leader, is it because you are a good manager or a good leader, or is it because you've been lucky that you've had the right people behind you, and then when you get too big and you take the top spot somewhere else and your true colors show, what is responsible for that?
Jay, I've been doing a podcast series this month on 1 month to better compliance through the use of human resources. And I had 2 podcasts I just wanted to highlight for our listeners this week if they haven't checked them out. In one, I talk about incentives in a compliance program for executives, and how you can incentivize executives through your compliance program to further your compliance agenda. And the second is really what are the negative aspects and implications of incentives and sales programs. And there I take a look at Wells Fargo from the compliance perspective. So if you're interested at all in your incentives, both incentivizing compliance and incentives in your sales structure, I would urge you to check out these two podcasts. I'm going to link to them in the show notes, and they're up on my website, FCPA-ComplianceReport.com, in my 1 month series, A 1 Month to Better Compliance Through HR. Jay, unfortunately, we're getting to near the end of our time, but I was wondering if you might be able to give our listeners a sneak peek at the Jay Rosen Weekend Report.
So, Tom, this week's weekend read is going to be ethics and compliance lessons you can learn at the zoo. The girls have been taking standardized tests all week. So as a surprise after school, we're going to pick them up, jot down to the San Diego Zoo. And tomorrow morning, we're going to have breakfast with the pandas. So I will let you know what type of ethics and compliance lessons I learned from our furry four-legged friends.
Well, that is one of America's greatest treasures, the San Diego Zoo. I've been there several times. I would only request that you would post a picture and or video of the hippos for Mrs. Compliance Evangelist. She's a huge hippo fan. And I wish you all a great amount of enjoyment at the San Diego Zoo. Jay, if I could, I am speaking at Compliance Week from May 22 to 24. I'm chairing or hosting a panel with Kara Brockmeyer and Ren McEachern, and we're going to talk about government investigations from their perspectives. Kara, now former head of the FCPA, the SEC's FCPA unit, Ren, of course, head of the FBI's FCPA unit. I'll also be on a panel with my Compliance Week colleagues, Bill Coffin and Joe Mont, and we're going to talk about compliance in the Trump administration, really the first 100 days. So if you're going to be at Compliance Week, please stop by and say hello to one of those two events. And then listeners to this podcast can receive a discount, and I'll link to that in that code in the show notes. Next week, I'm speaking two events in Philadelphia. So it'll be interesting to report on my ventures in the city of brotherly love, and perhaps have a Philly cheesesteak while I'm at it.
And end of next week, a week from today, I will be up in San Francisco for a one-day SCCE San Francisco one-day Ethics and Compliance Institute. And there'll be different local speakers there, and it'll be fun. So if anybody in the Bay Area and the ethics and compliance community has an opportunity to attend, it is next Friday, the 19th. So I look forward to seeing you up there. And I think that does it. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for spending some time with us and looking at the FCPA week that was for May 12th, 2017.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can reach Jay Rosen at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will join us for the next episode of This Week in FCPA.